The term Afrofuturism was first coined by Mark Derry in his 1993 essay, Black to the Future, which I'll link to in the description. It is defined as speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of the 20th century technoculture. What a mouthful. Since I've been hearing the term Afrofuturism used more and more, especially in the mainstream, I wanted to take a closer look at Afrofuturism as a sub-genre because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Now, this is part of my series discussing speculative subgenres. Obviously, I may not be the right person to go to if you want to know about Afrofuturism, but if I can spark your interest, hopefully you'll do your own Googling, and I'll have links below if you want to know more. The term Afrofuturism was first used to describe speculative literature, but it has since come to include art and music and movies and comic books. Just take a look at Black Panther and Wakanda Forever. And even though it has future as one of the root words, it refers to not just science fiction, but also other speculative genres like fantasy and horror. So it's often used to tag books like Kaylin Bayron's Cinderella is Dead, Marion James's Moon Witch, Spider King, Leslie Banks' Vampire Huntress series, and so on. Most definitions of Afrofuturism focus on African American artists, with the emphasis on American. So yes, if you're looking for stories reflected through the Black American cultural lens, maybe expressing critical race theory or intersectionality, and certainly stories that are informed by the lived African American experience, then Afrofuturism as a subgenre is something that will be of interest to you. But there's been pushback by non-American Black authors, specifically African authors such as Nnedi Okorafor, who sees Afrofuturism as having a specifically Western slant that doesn't reflect her stories about an African future by an African writer. Therefore, she has coined a new term, Africanfuturism. And then she coined another term specifically for African fantasy, Africanjujuism. Again, these terms are aimed at non-Western Black stories informed through an African cultural lens. So, getting back to Afrofuturism, and to muddy the waters even more, because who doesn't love muddy waters, Afrofuturism can be divided into two subcategories, Afropessimism and Black optimism. And those are pretty much what they sound like. Afropessimism are pessimistic stories. Duh. But the pessimism comes from the view that our society is so warped by its foundations of colonialism and slavery that nothing good can ever come of it, at least not for a certain class of people. On the other hand, Black optimism are stories that envisions a future where society can evolve past its past, maybe even imagining a post-racial future, sort of like Star Trek. So, who was the first writer of Afrofuturism? That's an interesting question. Some people point to Octavia Butler and her novel Wild Seed, since it was the first science fiction novel with a protagonist specifically from Africa. Before her was Samuel R. Delany, of course, and before Delany, I don't think there was anything else. What? There was someone else? Are you talking about Ralph Ellison? Was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man speculative? What? Before Ellison? W.E.B. Du Bois? I think it'd be a stretch to call his writing Afrofuturism. Before Du Bois? Are you kidding me? Who was before Du Bois? Frederick Douglass? What? A contemporary of Frederick Douglass. Okay, let me introduce you to someone you have never heard of, unless you study Black history. Martin Delany. He was freeborn in Virginia in 1812 and lived a really interesting life. He was one of 3 Black students accepted to Harvard, but that was later rescinded because the white students protested. He participated in the Underground Railroad, helping resettle runaway slaves in Canada. And during the Civil War, he joined the Union Army and was the only Black officer who received the rank of major. But we're talking about Afrofuturism. How is Martin Delany an Afrofuturist? Well, before the Civil War, Martin read a little novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Maybe you've heard of it. Martin praised the depiction of the cruelty of the white slave owners, but didn't think the portrayal of the Black characters was very realistic. I mean, there's a reason that Uncle Tom is used as a pejorative, and those criticisms go way back to, well, Martin Delany. Anyway, Delany decided to write his own story, and this is a what-if story.
That there are 3 kinds of science fiction: what if only, and if this goes on.
Now, if you agree that what-if stories are speculative in nature, this is very probably the very first Afrofuturistic story, an alternate history story, because it imagines what if the slaves in the South rose up, started an insurrection, and then established their own nation-state in Cuba. And yes, I think it is safe to say this was an Afrofuturistic story of the Black optimism variety. The novel was called Blake, or The Huts of America, A Tale of the Mississippi Valley, the Southern United States, and Cuba. The novel was serialized in the Weekly Anglo-African magazine, but unfortunately, there are no surviving issues of the magazine that contain the last 6 chapters of the novel. So the only copy we have is incomplete. But how fascinating is it that one of the first American science fiction stories was written by a Black man before the Civil War? And what a testament it is to the power of speculative fiction that empowers writers to extrapolate alternate histories to give readers hope and imagine possibilities. The question for you, of course, is whether or not the subgenre of Afrofuturism is useful to you. For me, sometimes it feels a little too broad. In other words, I'm not sure it tells me enough of what sort of novel I'm picking up. But on the other hand, it does tell me it's written by a Black author and probably has themes or worldviews arising from that author's lived experience, and maybe that's enough. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.